Welcome to our channel English Avenue. Today we bring another story for practice listening and speaking skills, and also special vocabulary that you should use in your daily life conversation. My name is Emma, and my mother, Margaret, has always been the heart of our home. Every time we step into the kitchen together, it feels like we're creating more than just a meal. We're crafting memories that will last a lifetime. I remember it like it was yesterday, the day I spent cooking with my mom in our cozy kitchen. The sunlight was pouring through the small window, casting a warm glow over the countertops and filling the room with a cheerful energy. I had just turned 18. And although I had helped my mom in the kitchen many times before, this time felt different. I wanted to learn everything, not just how to cook, but also the stories behind each dish, the memories, the laughter, and the love. It was a Saturday morning, and the aroma of fresh coffee filled the air as I walked into the kitchen. Mom was already there, wearing her favorite apron, the one with little blue flowers on it. She greeted me with a warm smile, and I knew we were in for a special day. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said, handing me a cup of coffee. "Are you ready to cook up a storm today?" I nodded eagerly, taking a sip of the rich, warm coffee. "Yes, Mom. What are we going to make today?" She laughed softly, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "I thought we could start with something simple but delicious. Our family's famous chicken pot pie. It's your grandmother's recipe, and she passed it down to me. Now it's time for you to learn." We gathered all the ingredients: chicken, carrots, peas, potatoes, onions, flour, butter, and some fresh herbs from the garden. As we started chopping the vegetables, Mom began to tell me about how she learned to cook from my grandmother. "When I was about your age," she began, "your grandmother would have me in the kitchen every Saturday just like this. She was a wonderful cook, and she believed that the best way to show love was through food. I remember how she would chop the onions so finely, her hands moving quickly and precisely. She always said that the secret to a good chicken pot pie was in the onions. They had to be just right." I watched as Mom demonstrated the perfect way to chop the onions, and then I gave it a try. My hands weren't as quick or as precise as hers, but she smiled and encouraged me, saying that it just took practice. As we worked, the kitchen filled with the comforting sound of sizzling onions and the savory smell of chicken cooking in the pan. We moved in rhythm, chopping, stirring, and mixing, all while sharing stories and laughing together. Mom told me about her childhood, how she would sneak extra cookies from the jar when Grandma wasn't looking, and how she once accidentally used salt instead of sugar in a cake. We were both laughing so hard at that story that tears came to our eyes. "Grandma wasn't too happy about that cake," Mom said, still chuckling. "But she let me eat the first piece, and I pretended it was the best cake I ever had, even though it was horrible." We continued to cook, and as the pot pie filling came together, Mom began to tell me another story, this time about how she met my dad. "You know," she said, her voice softening, "your father and I met in the most unexpected way. I was working at a small cafe in town, just trying to make some extra money while I was in college. One day he walked in looking so handsome in his uniform. He was in the army then, and I could tell he was nervous. He ordered a coffee, but when I handed it to him, he knocked it over. Coffee went everywhere. I couldn't help but laugh, imagining my dad, usually so calm and collected, fumbling with a cup of coffee. "What did you do?" I asked. "Well," Mom continued, "I laughed just like you're laughing now." He looked so embarrassed, but then he started laughing too. We spent the rest of his visit talking, and by the time he left, I knew I wanted to see him again. As we rolled out the dough for the pie crust, Mom told me about their first date, how Dad took her to a small park by the lake where they had a picnic. He brought sandwiches, but they were a little too plain, she said with a grin. So the next time I made sure to pack the food. I made this very chicken pot pie, actually. I smiled, realizing how much this dish meant to my family. It wasn't just food. It was a symbol of love, care, and tradition. As we layered the filling into the pie dish and covered it with the flaky, golden crust, Mom told me about the first time they kissed. "It was under the stars," she said, her eyes distant as she remembered. "We had just finished eating, and the night was so still, so perfect. Your father looked at me with those deep brown eyes of his, and before I knew it, we were kissing. It was soft, gentle, and I knew in that moment that I wanted to spend the rest of my life with him." I could see the love in her eyes as she spoke, and it made me feel so connected to her, to my dad, and to our family history. The stories she shared weren't just stories. They were a part of me, a part of who I was becoming. After we finished making the pie, we put it in the oven and sat at the kitchen table, sipping on more coffee and continuing to talk. Mom told me about their wedding, how it was small and intimate, with just close family and friends. She laughed as she described how Dad got so nervous during his vows that he almost dropped the ring. When the pie was ready, we took it out of the oven, and the golden crust was perfectly crisp, the filling bubbling up around the edges. The kitchen smelled heavenly, and I couldn't wait to taste it. We let it cool for a few minutes, then cut into it, the flaky crust giving way to the rich, savory filling.
We sat down to eat, and as I took my first bite, I realized how much love and care had gone into making this simple dish. It was delicious, the flavors blending together perfectly, just as Mom had said. As we ate, we continued to share stories, laughing and reminiscing about the past. I felt so close to my mom in that moment, like we were sharing something special, something that would stay with me forever. That day in the kitchen wasn't just about learning to cook. It was about connecting with my mom, learning about her life, and understanding the love that had built our family. It was about passing down traditions, sharing memories, and creating new ones. And as I finished my slice of chicken pot pie, I knew that one day, I would be in the kitchen with my own children, telling them these same stories, and teaching them how to cook with love. After we finished our meal, we cleaned up the kitchen together, the conversation flowing easily between us. Mom showed me how to properly store leftovers and how to clean the counters so they were spotless. As the evening drew to a close, we sat down in the living room with a cup of tea. Mom looked at me with a smile and said, "I'm so glad we had today together." It reminded me of all the times I spent with my own mom in the kitchen. I hope you'll remember these moments too. I will, Mom, I said, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the day we had shared. I'll never forget them. And I knew deep down that I wouldn't. Cooking with my mom that day had taught me more than just how to make a perfect chicken pot pie. It had taught me about love, family, and the importance of passing down traditions. It was a day that I would carry with me for the rest of my life. A day that had filled my heart with warmth, laughter, and love. Vocabulary list. 1. Cozy, warm, and comfortable. Example: the cozy kitchen was filled with the smell of fresh coffee. 2. Savory. Pleasantly salty or spicy, often used to describe food that is not sweet. Example: the savory filling of the chicken pot pie was delicious. 3. Flaky. Breaking or separating easily into small, thin pieces, often used to describe pastry. Example: the pie had a perfectly flaky crust. 4. Tradition. A custom or belief that is passed down from generation to generation. Example: cooking together on Saturdays was a family tradition. 5. Reminisce. To talk or think about past experiences or events with enjoyment. Example: we spent the afternoon reminiscing about old times. 6. Intimate, private, and personal, often used to describe a close and warm relationship. Example: their wedding was a small, intimate ceremony. 7. Gratitude. The feeling of being thankful or appreciative. Example: I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the day we had spent together. 8. Bubbling. To make bubbles while cooking, often used to describe liquids that are boiling or simmering. Example: the pie filling was bubbling up around the edges. 9. Precise. Exact and accurate. Example: Mom's hands were precise as she chopped the onions. 10. Heavenly. Extremely pleasant or enjoyable. Example: the kitchen smelled heavenly as the pie baked in the oven. I always loved spending time in the kitchen with my mom. It wasn't just about the cooking. It was about the bond we shared, the stories we told, and the laughter that filled the room. One particular afternoon stands out in my memory. A day when I learned more than just a recipe. I learned about the woman my mother was before she became my mom. It was a rainy Sunday, the kind of day that makes you want to stay inside, warm and cozy. The raindrops were tapping softly against the windows, and the air had that fresh, clean smell that only comes with a good rain. I walked into the kitchen to find Mom standing at the counter, a large bowl in front of her and a bag of flour open beside it. She was preparing to bake bread, something she did whenever she wanted to create a little warmth in the house. "Hey, Mom," I said, walking over to her. "Can I help?" She looked up and smiled, her eyes lighting up. "Of course. I was just about to start mixing the dough. It's perfect timing." I washed my hands and joined her at the counter. She had already measured out the flour, yeast, and salt, and was ready to mix everything together. I grabbed a wooden spoon and began stirring, watching as the ingredients started to come together into a sticky, doughy mass. "You know," Mom said as she dusted the counter with flour, "making bread always reminds me of my grandmother. She used to bake every week, and I'd always help her. She had this old wooden table in her kitchen, and we'd knead the dough right on top of it. The smell of fresh bread would fill the whole house." I listened intently, picturing my great-grandmother in her kitchen, her hands covered in flour as she worked the dough. "What was she like?" I asked, curious to know more about the woman who had taught my mom to bake. "She was a strong woman," Mom replied, her voice filled with admiration. "She raised 7 children on her own after my grandfather passed away. She was tough but kind, and she always made sure there was enough food on the table, even when times were hard." I could see the pride in her eyes as she talked about her grandmother, and it made me feel even closer to her. We continued to work the dough, kneading it until it was smooth and elastic. It was hard work, but there was something soothing about the repetitive motion, the feel of the dough under my hands. As we shaped the dough into loaves, Mom began to tell me another story, one I had never heard before. "When I was in college," she began, "I used to work part-time at a bakery. It was early mornings, and I'd have to be there by 4 a.m. But I didn't mind because I loved the work. I loved the smell of the bread baking, the way the dough felt in my hands, and the satisfaction of pulling a perfect loaf out of the oven." I looked at her in surprise. "I didn't know you worked at a bakery." She smiled and nodded. "I did. And that's where I met your dad, actually. He used to come in every morning for a coffee and a bagel before work. At first I didn't pay much attention to him, but he kept coming back every single day. Eventually we started talking, and one day he asked me out. I laughed, imagining my dad, persistent and charming, wooing my mom with his daily visits. "So, what happened on your first date?" Mom blushed a little, a smile tugging at her lips. "He took me to this small Italian restaurant. It was nothing fancy, but it was cozy, and the food was delicious. We talked for hours about everything and nothing. I think that's when I knew he was someone special. We placed the loaves in the oven, and as they baked, the kitchen filled with the most amazing smell, warm, yeasty, and comforting. We sat down at the kitchen table, sipping on tea, and Mom continued her story. Your dad was different from anyone I'd ever met. He was kind, patient, and he had this way of making me feel like I was the only person in the room. After that first date, we were inseparable. He'd pick me up after my shift at the bakery, and we'd go for long walks, just talking and enjoying each other's company. I could see how much she loved him, even after all these years. It was in the way she spoke about him, the soft look in her eyes, and the smile that played on her lips. It made me think about how important it is to find someone who makes you feel loved and valued. The timer on the oven beeped, and we got up to check on the bread. The loaves had risen beautifully, their crusts golden and crisp. We pulled them out and placed them on a cooling rack, and the smell that filled the kitchen was nothing short of heavenly. As we waited for the bread to cool, Mom told me about the day Dad proposed. It was the most unexpected thing, she said, a twinkle in her eye. We were walking in the park just like we always did. The sun was setting and the sky was this beautiful shade of pink. He stopped, turned to me and said, "I can't imagine my life without you. Will you marry me?" I gasped, even though I knew how the story ended. "What did you say?" Mom laughed. I was so surprised that I just stood there for a moment staring at him. But then I said yes, of course. I couldn't say anything else. It was the easiest decision I ever made. We sliced into the bread, the crust crackling as the knife went through. The inside was soft and airy, and when I took a bite, it was like tasting a piece of heaven. The bread was perfect, but what made it even better was the time we had spent making it together, the stories we had shared, and the love that had gone into every step. As we sat there enjoying the bread with butter and honey, I felt a deep sense of connection to my mom, to my family, and to the generations of women who had come before me. The stories she had told me were now a part of me, just as much as the bread we had made together. That day in the kitchen wasn't just about baking bread. It was about sharing a piece of our lives, of our history. It was about understanding where we came from, and the love that had shaped our family. It was a day that I would carry with me, just like the stories Mom had shared, a day that had filled my heart with warmth and the knowledge that I was part of something much bigger than myself. And as I finished my slice of bread, I knew that one day, I would be in the kitchen with my own daughter, telling her these same stories, and teaching her how to bake bread with love. Vocabulary list. 1. Elastic. Able to return to its original shape after being stretched or compressed. Example: the dough was smooth and elastic after kneading. 2. Yeasty, having the smell or taste of yeast. Often used to describe freshly baked bread. Example: the kitchen was filled with a yeasty smell of fresh bread. 3. Crackling, making a sharp, sudden sound. Often used to describe the sound of a crisp crust being cut. Example: the crust was crackling as we sliced into the bread. 4. Persist. To continue to do something, especially when it is difficult or when other people are against it. Example: my dad persisted in visiting the bakery every morning until Mom noticed him. 5. Inseparable, always together. Not able to be separated. Example: after their first date, my parents were inseparable. 6. Cozy, warm, comfortable and safe, especially because of being small or enclosed. Example: the small Italian restaurant was cozy and perfect for a first date. 7. Admiration. A feeling of respect and liking for someone or something. Example: I could hear the admiration in Mom's voice when she talked about her grandmother. 8. Heavenly, very pleasant or enjoyable, often used to describe food or smells. Example: The smell of the bread baking was heavenly. 9. Unexpected. Not what someone thought would happen. Not anticipated. Example: the proposal was completely unexpected, catching Mom by surprise. 10. Generations. All of the people born and living at about the same time regarded collectively. Example: the stories Mom told me connected me to the generations of women in our family.